Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite Antonia Hamidi. Antonia works on China's pursuit of tech self-reliance, especially in the area like semiconductors and operating systems, its internet infrastructure, and disinformation and hacking campaigns. Antonia also developed modeling and big data analysis too. She gained experience as a project manager at the many institutes, and also, again, she's a journalist in Asia. She covers extensively regarding the relationship between China and Russia. Antonia, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you for having me.
No problem, Antonia. The pleasure is all mine. Now, again, when I initially discovered you, because this amazing article that you co-authored and is entitled, China Moves to Fill the Void Left by Russia's Sanctions on Its Own Terms. At the beginning of the article, I want to read something to you that you wrote. It says, since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, China has been careful to officially maintain its pro-Russian neutrality. Antonia, let's be more realistic. When the world watches the war in Ukraine, it's rather difficult to pick the side. Either you are with Ukraine or you're with Russia. But at the beginning of the paragraph that you put a phrase called China had this pro-Russian neutrality. Can you help us to what is the logistics behind the concept? In other words, what is the attitude or what is the message that you're trying to say regarding China's position in the war of Ukraine?
I think you are correct in that sort of for the West, it is quite easy to say, well, yeah, you're either on this side or on the other side. For China, they are trying very, very hard not to take sides, which is very difficult for us to understand because obviously one is morally right and one is morally wrong. But they are trying very, very hard to not take sides. They don't support Russia with military weaponry. They don't want to join the war, basically. But at the same time, for them, they sort of amplify Russian narratives about how the US is basically responsible for the war and the eastward expansion of NATO is the main cause of the war. And I think for them, what is very, very important is the stability of the Russian nation. So some of my colleagues like to call it not a pro-Russian neutrality, but an anti-American neutrality. They have, and Ukraine has actually struggled with that quite a bit as well, with how does Ukraine position itself with regard to China? Because China had extensive relationships with Ukraine before the attack, and still has these relationships, and they don't want to break them up. Because Ukraine is also actually an important weapons dealer for China. So China is really trying to do this balancing act. But what has been very, very clear recently is that they have effectively picked a side, but they are falling short of sort of making a very public statement and also of anything that would involve them getting targeted by any sanctions. So these are, I think, the two sort of red lines that they're thinking, that they're maintaining. One is we don't officially endorse the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the second is we don't want to be hit by any sort of sanctions. So they will do stuff to circumvent the sanctions, but they won't do stuff that goes explicitly against the sanctions.
Antonia, I think at this moment that when everyone is talking about the behavior of Putin and the reactions from China, very likely, again, most of us are very hesitant to ask the question, but we can't resist the temptation to ask, what is the relationship between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin today? So in other words, again, from this historical perspective, that Putin and Xi Jinping and also the predecessor of China, has always been in this hot and cold relationship. But since 2012, this crucial year that Xi Jinping became the president of the country, that people begin to see this rising power under Xi Jinping and also this unstoppable leadership of Vladimir Putin. Eventually today, people are saying that the reason why Putin is gaining so much confidence, or Putin is gaining so much skillful in manipulating the people or manipulating the war, simply because it has the support from Xi Jinping or from the Chinese government. So that's why we would love to ask the question, and I want you to help us to understand, what is the relationship between Putin and Xi Jinping at this moment? Is it just pure diplomatic relationship, or there's something much deeper that we should know but yet to be discovered?
So I think, first of all, I'm not a Russia expert. I have quite a bit of experience with China, especially with sort of tech stuff, but I'm not a Russia expert. From what I have understood so far, Putin's relationship with Xi Jinping is complicated. So they have a lot of shared interests, and I think their relationship is really, really driven by these shared interests. As you have said, Russia's and China's historical relationship is very much fraught. There's a lot of history, and not all of it is good. But Putin and Xi Jinping, they have a lot of shared interests. They are against the US, they are against an expansion of NATO, they perceive themselves as sort of rising superpowers. But there are also issues, of course. One is, who is the junior partner and who is the senior partner? In technology, for example, Russia is usually the junior partner. But in weapons stuff, China is usually the junior partner. And what we do see is that even agreements bartered between Xi Jinping and Putin, they're not necessarily, yes, they can barter them, but the reality on the ground is often that it won't happen in the way. There has just been a really good article about sort of a cooperation with regards to building a passenger plane, which is basically dead, because the Russian and the Chinese side couldn't agree on who would be leading the project. They couldn't agree on what kind of blueprint they basically would be using. And on the Chinese side, there was a lot of hesitation, because people felt that everyone who knew something about sort of building these airplanes in Russia has since retired. So Putin and Xi Jinping, in this case, they bartered the agreement. It was really a high-level thing, and they seem to be driven by these shared interests. But the reality on the ground is often, in both countries, that it's not like Xi Jinping says this happens and now this happens, especially in economic and tech terms. There is a lot of nuance involved there. A lot of people with a lot of different interests are also playing a role there.
Antonia, I know you're quite an expert in technology, but I want to go back to this economic factors. Again, going back to the article, this is something that you wrote. Chinese exports to Russia plummeted following the outbreak of war, but have since rebounded. And in contrast to EU and the US exports, this initial slowdown was most likely due to the weakness of the Russian economy. Now, when we look at this economic change, and we know that on the general sense, the economic outlook for China seems very promising, especially today that under this Belt and Road Initiative, and also, again, a lot more experts believe that Chinese economic seems to be the future of the world, however you want to put it. But on the other hand, people are facing the reality that China today is facing a major economic slowdown, given this condition, the pandemic, and also population growth, and etc., and also this political hurdles. So from your perspective, who is more dependent on whom today? So in other words, what is the economic relationship between those two countries? And also this war indeed brought energy, oil prices, and so much more that damages to the community. So again, how should we understand this economic relationship between China and Russia today? And also, can we trust that China's economy or this economic outlook is actually the blueprint or the promising for the future?
So there's a couple of parts to this. The first one is, I think in terms of economics, it is very, very clear that Russia is the junior partner and Russia is very, very dependent on China. Yes, China is dependent on oil from Russia, But Russia is also very dependent on having someone buy the oil. So there is a mutual dependence, but I think it is very, very clear that Russia is more dependent on China, especially now that Russia basically has no outside options anymore. All the major economies in the world, let's take aside India, which is probably the only major economy that is still doing big business with Russia at this point, don't do business with Russia anymore. So China has a lot of leverage, but at the same time, there is the political dimension that also goes with this. China also has a lot of incentive to keep Russia stable, because currently Russia is basically between China and the West. This entire border, there's Russia basically. So they want to keep them stable. That is the one side. The other side is, of course, that's how positive is China's outlook in the world. And I think we do expect some sort of hard landing or maybe soft landing. We do expect that economically they won't grow 10% this year. They might not even grow 5%. But even at the level that they're at, they still are the largest economy in the world. And even without a lot of growth, they are still very, very important for a lot of manufacturing processes, for a lot of things that we in the West, for example, are also very dependent on. Let's look at semiconductors, for example, where China is dependent on Western machinery, but the West is dependent on Chinese manufacturing. And building up these manufacturing capacities takes 5 to 10 years. So even if we get a hard landing with the Chinese economy, and the Chinese economy is basically in big trouble, there is still this dependency. And it is still going to be a lot better than the Russian economy. Basically, something that we can say confidently now is that the Russian economy is in big trouble. We know that because, of course, all of the sanctions, and Russia was quite dependent on Western technology, Western everything, and now they still get enough money, like foreign reserves, just by exporting the oil and gas. But everything else is really, really problematic. In the short term, it might not be as problematic, because they have rearranged their economy to be basically war-driven, or like parts of it at least are war-driven. They have lost quite a few people, which is of course a huge issue, because they lost the more tech-savvy people, the better educated people. So I think long-term economic prospects for Russia at this point aren't good. And this is one of the reasons why why the Chinese government feels it's important to help out there a little bit. But at the same time, the Chinese government is still very much focused also on, if we engage there, we should make a profit. So it's not like completely altruistic, we just sell our stuff there very cheaply. Instead, it's like we are the only ones still selling there, so we can drive the price high. And this is one of those, this is a place where I think there are some contradictions that they also haven't really resolved just yet. What we see, and sort of at the beginning of the pandemic, at the beginning of the invasion, right after the invasion, it sort of looked like China would be disengaging from Russia for a while. But then now we can actually see that they didn't disengage from Russia, but they also didn't go all in. If trade with Russia was stopped for China right now, it probably wouldn't be a huge issue, except for the resources, where they are also where they also have a lot of stock. So they could probably wait it out for 6 months without any major problems. But it's still important for them to keep this relationship going, and to make sure that Russia stays an important part of the international community.
Antonia, I want to get into our conversation regarding technology. Again, as you mentioned previously, semiconductors are very important, not only for China, but also for the US. And today, if I'm not mistaken, that the relationship, especially from this technological perspective, between US and China today, is completely in this deadlock. So in other words, it's a really neck to neck competition in terms of developing these semiconductors. But in reality, some experts believe that China's progress in developing semiconductors are actually falling behind. So that's why it's putting additional pressure on the Chinese government as well. Now, you're the expert in technology. Antonia, can you help us to understand what is happening to the semiconductor business today in China, and what are the reasons for Chinese government to be so worried regarding this technological competition with the US?
Okay, that is actually a big question. So I'll try and break it down. First of all, what is happening with semiconductors in China? Well, semiconductors in China, we see a lot of development there, but we also see a lot of state-driven development. So the Chinese government is investing quite a lot of money into making sure that they have a domestic industry. Recently, there have been big corruption allegations within this industry, and this is, for us, one indicator that they have probably stayed behind sort of what kind of aspirations the Chinese government has had. We know that the Chinese government is still very, very dependent on especially machinery. So they can build most chips, not the most high-class chips, but most chips, but they can only build those with Western machinery or machinery from TSMC, which is obviously a Taiwan-based company. So that is a huge issue for them, because they have found out, and other players have also found this out, that semiconductors are really one of the key areas for the future. Just now, a Russian general, I think a couple of weeks ago, a Russian general said that the DJI drone, which obviously needs semiconductors, is basically a hallmark of modern warfare. So this is not only important for consumer electronics, but also very, very much important for the military. And the Chinese government is very, very worried about being dependent on the US and the West more generally. And I think recent events have shown that there is some reason for them to be worried. Like the US CHIPS Act, for example, that was just passed.
That's right.
That basically says if you want to apply for and get money within the US CHIPS Act, for example, to create more factories in the US, you cannot create specific type of high-tech factories in China, and you also cannot expand operations in China. So for the time that you take this money, you cannot expand your operations in China within high-tech processes. And these high-tech processes, in this case, it's 28 nanometers and below. So that's not current generation. That's 2-3 generations behind, and all the generations in between. So China is right to be worried, and they have identified semiconductors and some other points as sort of choke points, they usually call them, 桥脖子, and they would like to become independent in all of these areas. But we have also seen that this state-driven approach that they have taken for pretty much all of the areas has been running into a lot of trouble. You need a lot of talent for that, which they have trouble attracting. With zero COVID, even more than before, like they have trouble attracting foreign talent, and Chinese talent is still often not as experienced as sort of what they might be able to get abroad. And at the same time, there is just this issue of the state doesn't necessarily know which companies are the best. And with the anti-corruption allegations that we have seen recently, we have seen that there have been quite a few companies that were founded by one or two guys, no background in semiconductors at all, who were able to basically grab millions of renminbi and create a company. But in actuality, nothing was happening there. And this was a pattern that we see time and time again with these state-driven approaches to trying to get innovation going.
Antonia, I know you're very busy. I got two more questions before letting you go. Now, towards the end of the part of the article that you wrote, Again, it's one of the amazing content that I have to bring up. It's a paragraph that started with a subtitle that says "Closer to Russia, Further from the International Community," and this is what you wrote, and I quote: China-Russia relations have traditionally been characterized by competition, but with China's rise in the world politics, now Russia's war on Ukraine, they have become bound by a common enemy, the US and NATO. We know that not too long ago that during the one G7 summit, the seven largest countries got together and they tried to come up really hard to another major group project to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative. As a matter of fact, in this economic terms, they were hoping to rake more money than China in order to beat or in order to outrun this Chinese market. Now, I want you to help us to understand how successful do you think the G7 countries are going to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative? But meanwhile, don't you think this is actually a wild card to play against Russia and China at the same time? Because we know that if the gap is getting wider, which means more division, more economic backdrops are going to take place very soon. So help us understand in time.
Okay. Yeah, so BRI is obviously a huge issue. It has been in the news less recently, but I think that is not because there has been less money flowing or less investment. It has just been sort of the news cycle moves on, basically. And on the Chinese side, they have seen that there has been some pushback, so they have rebranded some of the initiatives. They have tried to make it more palatable to the West. I actually did a study a couple of years ago that looked at Western, especially OECD investment in the BRI countries. And what we found there was that in most BRI countries at this point, which was, I think, until 2017, there was more Western OECD investment than Chinese investment. But because it was mostly the individual countries doing it, it wasn't pooled anywhere. So it wasn't very, very clear how much was actually invested. And a lot of the time, the countries who we're talking about, which are less developed, they talk about how a lot of the OECD money, it comes with strings attached. And Chinese money doesn't come with strings attached. So I think there is a balance there. The new infrastructure fund that the G7 have set up or have said to set up now for the second time, actually, they did the same thing a year ago. And the fact that they have basically done the same thing now again, I think shows that it hasn't been very effective up to now. Is, I think, one of those things where the fact that we're 7 countries and we have to sort of coordinate is a disadvantage for the West. What we see is that the US, Germany, France, there's quite a few players there that are actually investing quite a lot in the region. But it's not being pooled. And from my conversations with people, I have also found that this isn't very likely to change, and we don't really see a lot of movement into let's bring it together and let's sort of have the same standards to do this, but instead it's like German standards, the US standards, because a lot of the time this is also sort of is related to commercial interests in the countries. Like the US, for example, is often engaging where it hopes its companies will also be able to engage. Of course, China is doing the same thing. Like part of the BRI was, well, we have all of these steel companies, but we don't want to build much more in China because it's not really effective to build much more in China. So let's go to other countries and build there as well. And the US and Europe have these same drives. But of course, it's always the question, so which company will get the advantage there? And this is a pretty big difficulty in this kind of coordinating exercise. So I do think we will see, and we will continue to see, a lot of investment and aid from the West. But I'm not very hopeful that this initiative will be a very coordinated and pooled initiative in the BRI that will even part of it is just perception. I don't think it will be perceived as this is countering the BRI. It will be the US is doing something, Germany is doing something, and this will not be perceived the same way as China is doing all of these things.
Antonia, I want to wrap up our conversation with something that, again, is going to take place very soon. For the G20 summit, how could we expect some of the economic changes, especially from the Chinese side? Do you think the Chinese government is willing to go extra miles in order to help with the world economy? What's your take on that, Antonia?
So the G20 summit is, of course, important. It is really, in recent years, it has been one of the few chances for leaders at this level to interact. We have heard some mumblings that maybe Xi Jinping will be visiting the US at one point, maybe even before the G20 summit. So that is a possibility, but it hasn't been confirmed. Maybe he'll also visit Riyadh, which also hasn't been confirmed. It is very, very unclear. But there is sort of there is something new happening, which I don't expect it, but it is a possibility. Then what kind of things do I expect? To be honest, not much. The G20, especially with these terms of high-level leaders meetings, they haven't really done a great deal recently, in recent years. And I think Xi Jinping won't be willing to do anything he wouldn't have done anyway. He might be willing to sort of repackage some stuff. If he has been re-elected at that point, we might, but that is a very, very big if and a very, very big might, see some sort of loosening of zero COVID, which currently he's probably keeping around because this was one of the things that is sort of important for him and his legitimacy. But if this is not an issue anymore, it might be we still want dynamic zero COVID, but maybe dynamic zero COVID means something different. And that could be sort of an outcome, but I don't expect anything to actually be decided there. I expect that they will travel there with, we will do this, and then we'll find a nice way to package this. And at the same time, I think internationally, which you have also alluded to, there isn't a lot of space for this kind of cooperation that we might have expected 10 or 20 years ago. It is very, very clear that the US has taken a side, China has taken a side, Europe has increasingly taken a side. So if anything was to happen substantively in terms of cooperation, I wouldn't expect that to happen within the G20. I would have expected that to happen with bilateral meetings with Xi Jinping and Joe Biden, for example.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm speaking to Antonia Hermidy, and Antonia works on China's pursuit of tech self-reliance, especially in areas like semiconductors and operating systems, and also its internet infrastructure and disinformation and hacking campaigns. And most importantly, that encourage everyone to go online, look for Antonia's recent article, again entitled, China Moves to Fill the Void Left by Russia's Sanctions on Its Own Term. Antonia, thank you so much for taking your time to be on the show. It's been a pleasure of speaking to you, and we'd love to have you back on the show again as we continue to pay attention and follow this political and also this economic partnership between China and Russia. Thank you, Antonia.